Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Mark Hatch and Susan Tree continue their conversation on decade by decade, how has admissions changed? Last week they covered the 80s and the 90s. This week they'll cover from 2000 to 2010, 2010 to 2020, and 2020 through 2023. A question from a listener comes from Brandy from Houston, and she wants to know any advice for my student who's attended a small high school that's been kind of sheltered, and now he's looking at going to a really large school with large class sizes. And Julie and I will tackle that question. Julie and I will also continue our interview with Lee Coffin, and we're asking him tough questions about college admissions. And this is part 3 of 4. And we'll have the final part of Kevin Newton's interview on clearing and the UCAS system. Friends, you're about to hear part 2 of the discussion I moderated between Susan Tree and Mark Hatch, 2 veterans, both in their 5th decade of admissions. We recorded this all at the same time, so there'll be no admissions tip, no admissions vernacular or big number, but we will resume next week when Vince is in the saddle. But for now, enjoy the conversation with Mark Hatch and Susan Tree discussing the years 2000 all the way up to 2023. We're now into the 2000s. We survived the Y2K scare, the end of 1999. Mark, what do you want to say about 2000 to 2010?
So I landed in my current job in 2001, and enrollment management was in full swing. The internet and email was in full swing. So colleges were trying to save money on the P's, printing paper and postage, and beginning to email students. And databases allowed us to, not like some colleges do today, but we were beginning to track the emails that we sent. And then databases became much more robust, demonstrated interest in terms of being able to say, yes, this student saw us at a high school visit, and they also visited campus, and trying to put those 2 together and asking the question, is that better than only a student who only did a high school visit but not a campus visit? So things got very, very sophisticated. I will say that there were a large number of deans of admission that switched and had to have the science base, and not that they weren't artists and still recruiting, but there was a huge number of my colleagues and friends who either were rewarded handsomely in jobs that they kept for a few years, or they were let go. And sometimes I think the pressure, I felt like many of us were football coaches without that big salary and without the shoe contract or the radio show.
Wow.
And so, Mark, the pressure to achieve, to move your institution forward, to not just enroll a class, but that was the beginning of you're actually managing a brand for your institution.
And Susan, what do you want to add to that? Either what Mark said there or something that really stood out to you in the 2000s? Susan was still at Westtown because she was there 27 years.
Oh,
So you'll have to
yeah.
change your role. Both of you
Yeah.
ended up being at one institution for more than 2 decades here. Anything you want to comment on?
One thing for sure is that the very selective colleges started pulling away from some of the old-fashioned forms of recruiting, that they felt they could control their brand by kind of creating a, I don't even know how to say it, a holier than thou, or we're above that kind of recruiting now. We don't really have to go visit your high school or go to a college fair. So the very selective schools, which at that point was really schools admitting like under a third of the applicants, right? Started pulling away. So there was more of an impersonal tone. The relationships between high school counselors and their regional admission liaison, which many of us prized because that those people were so helpful in recruiting our students, and they understood our high schools and read applications with sensitivity to community and curriculum and things like that. But in the name of fairness, maybe, and elitism, they were deciding not to kind of go where the riffraff were recruiting. And my high school, Mark Stucker, I'm sure you remember this, we had about 100 college visitors come every year because we were an awesome school. We had a lot of diversity. You and I were awesome. But we had a lot of respect for the profession and the professionals. But we started losing those personal contacts with, the Ivy and the Ivy Plus group. And it was just simply a matter of competition. The yield protection, I think I first heard that phrase when colleges started turning down kids who were better qualified than others. And actually, Mark Hatch, you and I did this in the 1980s. We played with it, we were trying to predict enrollment, and we'd rather take a student whose credentials were a little bit softer, but who clearly were likely to enroll, than someone who appeared where the college appeared to be, 10th on the list of 10. But in the 2000s, the recruit to reject phenomenon raised its ugly head, with very selective colleges doing a lot of direct mail with kids who were clearly not going to be admissible, which continues today. The same time, China opened up as a market for colleges and probably started, that increase in international students, full pay international students, exploded in the US, and colleges were thrilled to begin moving in that direction. And anyway, those are the things that I remember. I was busy. I suddenly had children I was raising too in my life, and started thinking about the future in a slightly different way, which I think parents do as soon as you start worrying about your own kids' futures. And, Mark Stucker and Mark Hatch, we've all been there with thinking, what's it going to be like for our kids, and then living through that process.
A couple things. Isn't the ACT growing a lot at this time and expanding out? Because, obviously the SAT recentered, went to 2,400 points in 2005, and that was partly because it feeling the ACT on its heels. Any thoughts at all on that growth of the ACT is not just a Midwest test? And then, is this the decade where independent educational consultants started to really grow? Would you say? Would it start in here, or was it 2010? When did
it was certainly in 2000s, but the profession was not widely accepted. It was kind of looked down on, and I think it was in the 2010s where it became much more acceptable and respectable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we started with training and certification courses and so forth, which I think served all parties. Mark, and Susan, I remember when I was at Occidental, I joined what was the steering committee of the Common Application. And very quickly, they needed to be incorporated by law, and that mandated a board of directors. So I spent 6 years on the board, including a stint as vice president and then president of the Common App. And I want to say, in all sincerity, it was very much of a by the members, for the members entity, where we were always trying to be student centered and then serving the colleges of the Common Application. At the same time, moving away from the floppy disk and signing our first contract as a Common App board with a tech company, which was really one or two people running an electronic application out of their garage. And then the proliferation of applications because of the Common App, and many institutions sunsetted, sometimes a little bit of pressure from the Common App, their own application,
Right.
Because it was very much a paradigm where Common App didn't want an institution to say, well, yes, we're on the Common App, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge. If we really want to show interest, you do our own application. But I think that the increase in total number of applications per student was happening at the same time. Enrollment management was happening at the same time. Independent counselors were working with students and families, and we were all getting much more selective, for better, for worse.
And then you're coming off the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. How did that impact things, and what were you seeing with cost and what was going on there? Because that was, a tough time for '07, '08, '09 for the country as far as the economy. Did that trickle into admissions in any way? Mark? I think you have something you want to say.
I think we all ran scared for about 12 months. We hadn't seen a downturn in the economy for at least 10, or the stock market went down precipitously and very, very, very rapidly. I think we were all surprised and even overjoyed that 18 months later it had come right back up. But we were all preparing to make cuts, and we did, because endowments, the Colorado College endowment went from about $525 million to $375 million in about 5 months. And then it came back up another 9 to 10 months after that. But we were hunkering down and prepared to make deeper cuts at that time. And people watched their money very carefully. The return on the investment, the value for the price conversations were very heavy in college admission offices. And there started being view books that would be life at blank college and life after blank college that would come in tandem. So I think families were keenly aware of the investment they were making and that return on the investment, or the outcome, and looking at tangible evidence that kids were getting jobs.
I know one thing Chris Gruber said when I had him on from Davidson, that he really felt, coming out of that stock market dropping and the uncertainty it created, that's when a lot of schools beefed up the percentage of the class they took from early decision, and really sort of wasn't any going back since then. Any comments on that? Does that resonate with you, Mark?
Volatility of yield was significant, and 3, 4, 5 percentage points if you're off with yield. And I think at the time, running somewhat scared, even at selective colleges that could fill their class, our waitlist number of waitlist students climbed, and
Right.
and on both sides of the desk, I think there was a real beginning of the erosion in confidence in the waitlist and the waitlist process. Colleges weren't convinced, if the bottom dropped out on May 1st, that they were going to necessarily get there. And you would offer 2 waitlists on May 8th and then find out one of those students on May 10th got plucked from another waitlist. And then I think on the high school side, Susan can speak to this, it wouldn't be uncommon to have 6 students from a high school apply to a school and have 3 or 4 of them on a waiting list. And you might know that one of them really wanted to go, and one of them had no chance in getting off the wait list. And managing that from your side, Susan, probably was really difficult.
It was. And I think there was a point right around then, Mark, that colleges stopped caring whether or not the admissions decision in a given year made sense within that school community. That used to be something that really did matter, that they wouldn't necessarily line the kids up and admit them in order of grades or GPA. That never happened, because kids with, in holistic admissions, kids with, certain characteristics were always going to get a bump up. But it really didn't matter anymore to a college, in the tens, who else was applying from the school. They used the beginnings of those algorithms to predict enrollment. And those of us who'd been in schools for a while had to just let go of kind of that part of our life, that the decisions should make sense, and we had to start educating our kids and our parents to expect that they won't always make sense. And what can families do about that proactively?
And you're now talking about all those dirty little secrets that we're not supposed to talk about publicly.
Hey.
That's why our listeners tune in.
That's what we do on your College Bound Kid.
I can remember the day where we would see a high school where there were 10 applicants, and for institutional needs or priorities, we might be taking an athlete that was 7 on that list, just in a GPA rank. Obviously, we do holistic reviews, and you're far more than a GPA, but we were highly sensitive to potentially seeing the counselor. Susan, you were always so nice to be at NACAC, our national conference, but and then saying, well, wait a minute, you didn't take the 3rd, 4th, and 5th person on that list. And sometimes out of appreciation for a relationship with those high schools, we would call some of those students broad shoulders kids, because they carried 1 or 2 other kids into the class. But I think we were also starting to get real pressure to mold and shape and sculpt our classes with a much more specific lens, that we couldn't do that anymore. And counselors were frustrated that we became less predictable, and or frustrated that there were some protected categories that were getting more attention than potentially they should.
I could talk to you guys all day. This is really, really rewarding. Susan, finishing this decade up, anything we haven't touched on from your brain dump that you think's worth mentioning before we go to 2010 to 2020?
No, I think we really did well with this one, Mark. And we're starting to get into all the teasing stuff that went on in the 2010s.
So let's talk about the 2010. Mark, kick it off. What are your memories of some key landmarks and developments in this decade? Now we're getting not too far ago.
Yeah, I mean, coming out of the recession of 2009, 2010, there were lots of conversations from a high level, cabinet level at places like Colorado College about institutional resilience or sustainability. This really came as a huge surprise, and it was powerful and painful to see endowments drop and to see the uncertainty of yields and so forth. So we began thinking more long term. What's going to happen if we have another one, a recession that goes as deep and lasts twice as long? So we also, I think, began in saying we really need to invest in the marketing of colleges and not be shy about buying more names. Email became spam. And and that was back when in the early 2010s where students actually opened an email.
Some of the things I remember in the decade, Coalition was birthed. Remember how CA4, Common App 4 came out, and there were all those technical
fixes,
and then people sort of freaked out. We're putting all of our eggs in the Common App basket. And then, so Coalition came out around 2016. Was one of the changes. Was this the decade when China students started getting passports? Because I remember the decade before, there were a lot of Korean students, but China seemed closed, and then all of a sudden China started opening up. Was that this time? Because I know that The growth of international applications is something that we haven't talked that much about. Mark, when did you really see that hitting? Or Susan, either one of you?
When I arrived at Colorado College, 1% international. By 10 years later, by 2011, we were up at 7, 8%. And you started having specialists who were managing
Right.
international recruitment. With full blown websites, you started seeing websites and different microsites in different languages. You were keenly aware of how you were. Perceived or your market share country by country. China's always been a significant exporter of students, but there are other pockets that you paid a lot of attention to. For us, Hong Kong and Singapore became popular, although you'd go and you would interview at a hotel and you wouldn't know exactly who was signing up because they could now sign up on your portals. And oftentimes in Hong Kong, it would be students coming from mainland China overnight on a train to see you for half an hour. And so, yes, just a huge competition for some of the international students. And I was very proud during that decade, as I am today, that we created a more globally fluent, culturally diverse student body that really benefited a lot of our domestic students. But
Absolutely.
big business, and we haven't really talked about agents and working with international students, but there was in the 2000s, 2010s, there were colleges that were out of the way that wouldn't naturally maybe flyover country that wouldn't naturally attract international students. And all of a sudden there were people that said, for a fee, I'll get you 10 international students.
Yeah, I remember the debates about the ethics of that, you know,
Absolutely.
going on. Susan, what do you want to add on this decade? What do you want to comment on this decade?
On the tens,
Yeah.
we saw. Well, I just say ditto to what Mark Hatch said. For me, being in a college prep school, the decade started with the Race to Nowhere.
Remember that
That
documentary?
profoundly chilling documentary about the which kind of exposed the effects of the college admission process on kids, and that was literally 2010. I remember watching it with the faculty at my high school. And ironically, the decade closed in 2019 with the Varsity Blues scandal. So in the space of that year, we saw the arc from the education of the public about the deleterious effect of the college admissions process on the mental health of our teenagers. And the decade ended with the cheating scandal to hopefully end all cheating scandals, but we forget things very quickly. The exposure in the Varsity Blues scandal, which we're still hearing more and more about with these passing years, on the cheating on the standardized testing, falsification of accommodations on standardized tests, and the exposure of the side door in admissions, where everybody under the sun at very elite colleges were being bought off to designate kids as athletic recruits who had no athletic credentials and had no intention of playing. And the thing that grabbed us all by the throat was that these were among our country's most elite and selective institutions that were stooping to this low level, not colleges that were desperate to fill their classrooms. So those were the bookends of the generation. The good things in the middle were what we saw was the rise of curriculum innovation in the United States, that we began to move toward exploration and implementation of everything from mastery-based education and project-based learning to character education, and just some wonderful, wonderful changes. And AP was really no longer thought to be the gold standard, that there were lots of ways for high schools, well-resourced and not so well-resourced, to offer students a level of rigor that perhaps had not been available to them in the past.
From a recruiting strategy, tactics, or enrollment management, what did you see going on in this decade, Mark? I know, it feels like the increased selectivity has just been gradual. It's been going on now for several decades, but certainly a school like Northeastern totally saw its numbers change transformationally. BU's, a lot of schools saw drastic changes in their selectivity in this decade, but that was also happening the decade before too, Susan, which is the one you and I worked with, because
yeah.
I remember Chicago thinking 35% of kids in the early 2000s, and by 2010, more and more schools going to the Common App, of course, played a role in that. But Mark, what do you want to comment on here on this decade?
Yeah, I think that I think we were all surprised. And now we're reading online, no more paper,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing these wonderfully accomplished kids who on the portal on the screen looked like they were doing things with somewhat magical ease. But then coming to campus and realizing that our student life staff was really taxed by a higher level of anxiety. The number of students, and we're very proud to have great resources for students who might be dealing with mental health issues or learning differences. But the number of families that would hit us after the student was admitted or committed with a battery of things a litany of things that the high school had provided in terms of accommodations, and then certainly medications. And
Right.
I think we were shifting in our reading focus and asking questions about uh, students' character, ask kindness. This is the character collaborative, making caring common conversation, where we realized there were a lot of students who were, and these were students who were available or were here in the 90s and 2000s, but were students who were bringing the glue to campuses, for whom their excellence wasn't founding four clubs, but it might be a very clear pattern of generosity and kindness and compassion for others. At the same time, starting to pay real attention to, as we always had, but maybe more attention to some of our underrepresented students who had adult-like activities, taking care of a grandmother, going home and taking care of three siblings at home. And I wouldn't say a complete moving away from the achievement-oriented focus that still sometimes dominates college admission, but it's very much of building a student body of healthy, well-adjusted kids to the extent that that was possible.
Now, a couple of thoughts I had this decade. Growth of test optional. I mean, it's been increasing for a while, right? But it started getting into the universities. You have the Arizonas and the Temples and the Wake Forest and George Washington. It moved away from just the liberal arts schools to even into the national universities. Of course, nothing happened like since the pandemic. That took it to
Right.
a little different level, but there certainly was that. And then Mark, you can talk about sort of how something like Slate made a difference in admission office, or maybe you even want to broaden it to technology. Like I know you've already commented on moving away from paper, but why don't you talk about just how that really made reading and managing caseloads and things different, the advances in technology? Like what was it like
Sure.
before
Yeah.
till that decade? It feels like that decade was a big one for that because there still was some paper reading going on in that decade before. Some of the schools had moved to online in the latter part of that decade, '05 to '10, but you still had a lot that were still doing paper, but it felt like everybody had moved to some type of technological interface. What do you want to say about that,
We put chiropractors out of business because we would carry a bag of 100 files home. and didn't need a gym membership because we were lifting weights just trying to get in and out of the house. But I think that, Slate is a tool to empower young admission officers to understand trends at schools, to be able to flip back and forth from one file to the next. Sometimes if there were 5 students that applied from a high school and we wanted to put our hand on all 5 applications to look at together, it took 10 days before we can find that 5th file. And all of a sudden you can go back and look at historical data. You could keep effective notes for the young rep that might have been calling on Susan Tree at Westtown School, and 4 years in a row we might have three different reps or something, and so certainly the efficiency of being able to read online and going back to a part of the file. But at the same time, all these metrics of Big Brother metrics that some colleges purportedly are using, opens and click-throughs with emails, and sort of demonstrated interest at a higher level, that frankly served us pretty well with COVID and the pandemic, because a lot of metrics went out the window. But how much pressure students felt applying to more colleges and then managing, all of the different touch points that they thought some colleges were keeping track of. And indeed, some probably were, some weren't.
Now, what about the growth of like Ruffalondo Levitts and EAB and all of that? Was that kind of in this decade or the one before? They started getting mushed together with me.
One before, I think, but the proliferation of these companies that will do anything and everything under the sun to question your business model and talk about how to do it differently. And I've got a wonderful executive assistant who helps screen my calls, and I can remember in that decade, it felt like 3 times a day I'd hear something like, "Oh my gosh, well, my boss is so cheap; he's never going to buy that. You should see what he gave me for Christmas last year." And because these vendors would find you, and it didn't matter if it was a new video they wanted to sell, or some web enhancement, or some technology that allows you to predict your yield. I'm still waiting for robots to do my work.
Right.
But there's a craziness here that is still sort of under that category of sustaining your enterprise, managing a brand, even though we're all incredibly proud of providing a service and bringing great kids in.
This is great. Susan, any comments on this decade we haven't touched on?
Well, Mark, just think about all the colleges that have closed and merged. There are schools that, are throwing in the towel now because the predictions are that they are no longer sustainable. And there's going to be the passing of a generation of small regional colleges here that, maybe some of them were educating teachers for decades and then tried to become all things to all people too quickly, and they just didn't have the brand strength, or they just were from more modest backgrounds and the endowments aren't large. But even some more well-to-do colleges are eliminating academic departments and faculty positions. And we just all read about West Virginia University, which is a very popular and interesting place, having kind of wholesale faculty cuts, which is sending a ripple of anxiety through the community. And I think that is very telling, whether it's going to just get kind of be over in 10 years, that survival of the fittest. But I worry about the diversity of higher ed options for coming generations. The pandemic took a tremendous toll on a lot of colleges that just couldn't float their programs during hybrid and during closures.
Well, one thing we didn't talk about was states and even the federal government walking away from the commitment to education, right? I mean, Pell not keeping up anywhere near with cost of living, and certainly state appropriations really drastically moving away from state-based institutions and passing the cost on to parents and the explosion of college debt. Now that's
Yep.
you probably skipped a decade or two on that one. I know this has been happening for a while. It's hard to hit them all. So the last few years, this is now COVID. We can be a little quicker on this because a lot of our listeners have lived through this, and so
That's
they know
right.
that's taking back through yesteryear. It's hard not to kick this decade off by talking about how COVID has impacted things, just because it's been such a dominant theme. Mark, what do you want to say about 2021, 22, 23?
You know how painful those years were, even for admission staffs who love to be out on the road and traveling and connecting with kids, and the Zoom environment was never the same. I think the professional development and growth that comes from being in an office and working side by side with somebody, reading a file or working on a project. Some people did very well with the work from home environment, and other people didn't do very well with the work from home environment. So I think the staff turnover, people exiting the workforce, has really hit college admissions and college counseling very hard. And then, of course, seeing what students had to deal with in Zoom school for years, and really just incredibly challenging on all of us. I can't imagine what it was like to be an 18-year-old and have a year and a half of your high school career experience just taken away from you. If there's a silver lining, it's test optional admission.
Yes, indeed.
I simply do not believe it's going to come back. And I think colleges, even in the category of they would never go test optional, and they were forced to go test optional, now have the data to suggest that the tests really aren't as good of a predictor as some people think they would be. And so I think that's very positive. My two daughters went through the process, one of them in the height of COVID, and she didn't take one standardized test, period. She was snowed out right before COVID, and then she was locked out in COVID, and her college search process a weight was lifted by not having to take a test at all. I do hear that there were some students who drilled down and looked more thoughtfully at websites and departments and course descriptions because they couldn't visit places.
Right.
And I think there was some aspect of the college search that might have been deepened, except we all know that there's no real substitute to seeing a place.
But colleges had to start doing a much better job with their digital content. And it was slow at first when they suddenly all realized we better get campus tours on our website because no one's coming. Even if they come, we're not letting them on our campus. Things got a lot better faster. And I hope that continues because, you know, I saw the effect that it had on students that I was working with, where they could hear a faculty symposium on the engineering program, maybe sit in on, virtually on an activity in the robotics lab or the machine shop. I even had students telling me that they were sitting in on, classes virtually. And I hope that that level of virtual content continues because it is still moving kids down the pipeline toward applying, that they're ready for more sophisticated content earlier in the process because they got used to it. They got used to not visiting. And I think maybe more kids are going to wait until they're admitted to see if they can visit, who's making them an offer of admission and making it affordable. I wonder if we'll, except for the most affluent families in the country, see the level of campus visits return to where they were.
Well, this has been fantastic, Mark. You've been most generous with your time. We're grateful. We're gonna see if we can hit you up once a year because you're in the rotation now.
Wonderful.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Mark Stucker, we didn't even talk about the Supreme Court and what they're doing to us in the last couple of years. That's for another time.
Yeah, I was thinking about how so many things, even in this last year, right? Affirmative action, ChatGPT, legacy admissions under assault,
digital SAT,
yep, digital
enrollment
SAT.
cliff,
enrollment cliff, and then we have a new FAFSA about to
That's
So
right.
this is a very eventful 2023, but we have weekly programming to update
That's
our
right.
listeners on that. I think it's the historical stuff that people really appreciate, and it was just a pleasure for me to sit here and have two giants in the profession going back to the 80s, just talk through things. And so I just want to thank both of you so much for all of your contributions to the profession, and just thank you specifically for agreeing to have this multi-decade conversation. Can you believe you're in your fifth decade?
Yes. No, not really, but
Susan Tree, that's a very interesting picture over your left shoulder. Could you interpret that for me?
well, my father was an artist and painted for much of his adult life. So it's rather abstract. It's a color study, represents my brain at times.
And I apologize to those on the podcast that you certainly can't see that, but that was the exact same question that Susan Tree asked of me as a high school senior in her admission office, and I still don't have an answer.
And that was also one of my father's paintings.
So with that, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Susan. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Awesome. Bye.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Julia, another great question coming in. This one's from Brandy from Houston.
Hi, this is Brandy from Houston with a question for the podcast. My child has been at a small, private, rigorous college prep school his whole life since he was 6. And he's looking at some very large public state schools for college. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or advice about a child from a fairly sheltered, bubbly private school, small background, going to a very large public school with large class sizes and a very different scene. Thank you.
And so, like we've been doing, I'm going to let you take the lead on this and share your thoughts, and I'll chime in with a couple thoughts of my own.
Yeah, this is actually a great question. And this is something that if you had asked me maybe before I became a high school counselor, I might have had a different answer. And I hope whatever we say is helpful, Brandy. But I've actually been surprised and impressed with the ability of the adolescent to actually maybe take some risks that pay off here in terms of thinking about something really different. That being said, you're also the parent. You've had a little more life experience, and there may be absolutely things that the adolescent hasn't considered that will actually very much affect their life. So, while my school is maybe not that as small, it is a very insular group. A lot of the students who are at my high school also went to private schools as a child and have maybe been in classes of like 14 to 20 kids all their lives.
And Julia, why don't you let people know the size of your school, the size of the high school, just so they have a sense? I think that might be helpful. We've probably never done that before. Yeah.
Sure. So Milton Academy is actually a K through 12 school, but the majority of our students are in the high school, the upper school, and that's about around 750 students. But K through 12, each grade gets a little bit bigger in the middle school and whatnot, but it's not more than like 40 kids. And so at the end of the day, some of our lifers have really only ever known about 180 other students, and maybe haven't our lifers are day students actually. So a lot of the time they've only lived in this small little area outside of Boston all their lives. And our average class size is 14 students or fewer. And it is lots of interaction, lots of care for the students. So sometimes, big state schools are very popular with my students. And I do worry where I'm like, oh, you get comments 4 times a year. You have an advisor. You have 4 adults on you at any time to help you get what you need. You are going to have a very different experience when you go to Wisconsin or you go to UMass Amherst, where you're going to be sometimes a number and you're going to have certain advocacy skills. You cannot expect the same sort of adult interaction or connection. You can't expect the same sort of academic outcomes in the sense that you're kind of on your own. And I've actually seen a lot of my students, that's what they prefer. Even though they've grown up in an environment like that, they are actually ready to have to sort of fend for themselves, to learn how to make relationships with the TA or come to office hours. But that being said, I usually like my students to really try it on in a couple ways. We are lucky in the sense that we are coming out of the pandemic and that a student's ability to visit a college is much greater. But I would recommend actually sitting in a class. This is usually where my students decide, okay, I actually can do a big environment or I can't. I had a student who was deciding between a mid-size college and then UNC Chapel Hill. And even though the mid-sized college, she might still be in some lecture classes of maybe 300 students and whatnot. She found that at UNC, just sort of walking around, as much as she saw familiar faces and she liked the academics, sitting in this giant hall where she turned to somebody and they didn't have the same interaction that she had at a mid-size or small liberal arts schools that she was looking at, she realized, oh, I think actually I am better suited for an environment that is intentionally smaller. And also, I think doing an overnight is helpful, or also having the student maybe navigate the campus on their own. Even the process of basically being admitted to the college is actually really eye-opening for someone coming from a smaller environment, where you get this portal, and even to access the portal, you need to go through the IT department, not the admissions department. And you're learning this bureaucracy of this larger place that is probably not evident at, or not a factor at, your smaller sort of background. So this isn't to say that your instincts could be totally right and that it might not be a fit, but definitely let your child figure that out for themselves. I would also say you might know your child well, but if you try to kind of, at least in my experience, when a parent sort of inserts their opinion, even if it's correct or done with love, it's an indictment on the student and like, oh, you think I can't do this and I'm not ready. You're underestimating me. So even though you're trying to be helpful and guide them, I would really just give them exposure to all types of communities and sizes, and then let them kind of figure out what are going to be the pros and cons of this. And sometimes we have students actually make a pros and cons list. And when we look at the cons, like, I'm going to have to advocate for myself. I might not get into all the classes that I want. I might have to meet people in a different way, that we come up with plans about how the student is going to do that when that's not been something that's not been a skill they've had to sharpen or get to know. And then there's some compromises too. So sometimes at a larger institution, there might be an honors college, there might be some sort of special cohort, or there might be a special curriculum. I know at like some of my students really like the Center for Creative Studies at University of California, Santa Barbara. So there might be ways to also create some of those smaller sort of nurturing communities that you're used to at a larger place. So, but I would just say that you might be right. Also, hold back on the "I told you so"s, even if you are right. I have a hard time doing that actually as a counselor, but let the student figure it out for themselves, but expose them to a lot of different sort of size colleges, so that way they can really understand, where does size matter and where does it show up for me? Is it the community, the classroom, the resources? So that way the student can really make an informed decision. And if you're able and have the privilege to visit, maybe do an overnight, sit in on a class, that's a great way to figure that out.
Thanks, Julia. You said a lot of the things I wanted to say. I agree with everything you said. I'll just give a little bit of my background. So when I was at Westtown, working, with Susan, we typically would have 100 in a grade. But everybody boarded 11th and 12th. It's required boarding. So it did create this very strong residential community. Everybody went through the same shared experience. And then later, when I moved to Atlanta, become director of college counseling at KIPP, I was more of what's known as a CBO counselor. So I was responsible for graduates from 4 middle schools that were spread out over sometimes 30 or 40 high schools, including that's how I initially met Julia. I had kids up there in Milton, and eventually we worked together with both students from KIPP and then, private students as well. But those students were very different because they were coming from a small environment and sometimes going to small private environments and sometimes going to large environments. At Westtown, and really at KIPP as well, because the KIPP middle schools were small. The KIPP middle schools typically had about 60 in a grade. So they mirrored what you'd see in private settings, similar to what Brandy's student experienced. There can be this tendency for people to say, I'm so tired of small. I'm ready for the opposite.
Yes.
I see the same thing with my young ladies that attended single gender schools. They are so ready to be out. So, and that's understandable. You've experienced the benefits of small, intimate, everybody knows your business, but a lot of times you're tired of the pitfalls of that arrangement and you either want more anonymity or maybe you just want more everything, more your sports scenes and more choices of everything from people to courses to professors and all of that. So there can be a tendency to want that larger environment, particularly when I was at Westtown. And I think this was partly because like we were a little smaller than Milton, you guys were 180, we were 100, and then that strong residential. Some of the biggest complaints and hardest adjustments I felt students had was when they went to the big, larger university from that smaller environment. Like you said, they're used to 4 people being on them at one time and all of this closeness where they just had relationships with everybody. And a lot of times it was difficult when they went into what felt very impersonal. The whole idea that the professor doesn't even ever expect to get to know you was so foreign and felt really impersonal. Now, don't get me wrong. There are people that love that, and there are people that adjusted to it. But that first year tended to be more challenging, as you would expect, coming from such a different environment. But Jill, you said the main thing I wanted to emphasize, and you said it twice, and that is exposure. So my recommendation is exposure. I love to try to see if you can get an overnight in these situations. Now, most schools are not set up through their admission system to do overnight. Some are, but most are not. But one way you can do an overnight is if you know anybody or if you can use your network coming from a small school. A lot of times those relationships are intact. Or either you know somebody or a counselor knows somebody who would be willing to host you. That is very eye-opening. So I love overnights anytime a person can do them. Now, let's say you're applying to 12 schools. It's really hard to do 12 overnights. It's logistics, right?
Yeah.
So I love sitting in classes, like Julia said, when you can't do that. I like just spending as much time as you can on the campus.
Right.
Hanging out in the student union, going to a sporting event, musical, like spend as much time as you can and talk to as many students as you possibly can talk to. And this is not as good as visiting. It's not as good as talking to people, but I do see value in just reading hundreds and hundreds of reviews. In places like Niche and Unigo and other places, Scapex, student reviews. There's several websites that have tons and tons of reviews. I find when students read like dozens and dozens, even into the hundreds, they start to get an impression.
Right.
And then the last thing that I would say is trust your instincts. Like trust that feel that you get when you have that exposure. Do your research, do your analytical research. I'm not saying not to do that. I'm not saying to exclusively be touchy-feely. But I am saying that I like to use this example about a campus as like a magnet. It can like attract or repel, and like trust that, because you may not be able to identify what is it about you that is drawn to this place or that is repelled by this place, but there's something there, and trust it. And also on the exposure, and this is one of the things, Julia and I, Lisa, Linda, Susan, we all do this. We love to see you get on as many different kinds of campuses as you can. And this is a great project to do in 10th grade or even 9th grade if the student is up for it. Depends on the student. So, Lisa's been doing this with her daughter in the ninth grade and taking her to so many different environments, right? From the McGills all the way to the Richmonds I've gone with her on some of these trips as well, but just a wide range, American, GW, just all kinds of different sizes, different locations. That is very helpful to get a sense because size is one of those things people have a strong opinion of. Like there's
Yes.
some of the things I find people tend to have very strong opinions on with the college process. One is campus setting,
Mm-hmm.
large city, small city, suburban, college town, remote, rural.
Mm-hmm.
Then within a city, self-contained and closed campus versus when
Yeah.
it feeds into the city.
Yep.
People have very strong feelings on that. And then people have very strong feelings on distance from home
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times. People have strong feelings on just student composition.
Yes.
That could be racial, ethnic. It could be how sporty or preppy. Working with a student this year, she's like, I just want normal kids. Normal. My school does not have normal kids.
Yeah.
Give me normal kids. It could be anything. First gen students might be really sensitive to that. Jewish students might be really looking for a strong Jewish community. Same for South Asian, Black, Latinx, they might be looking for that critical mass. Or it's just basically people are really looking for, I say, this is my place, these are my people, this is my place. Like, are there people like me here? Like they want diversity, but they also don't want to be, I'm the only, whatever the only means.
Right.
Even know that they'll find people like them. So those are some things people feel strongly about, but size is one of those things people feel very strongly about. And I respect it highly when I'm working with students and they say, that place felt too small. I mean, Julia, that's one of the biggest criticisms that I would get of your old school.
Oh, me too. In fact, I don't give the size of it until my very last sentence on my pitch. Yes.
We're talking about Haverford College, ranked 1,300 students, and a lot of students will be like, I just can't do something smaller than my high school. I just can't. But on the other hand, there's a person that loves that, right? They love the access to sense of community and the access to professors and all of that. So it's so personal. It's just so personal. So exposing to different sizes, trusting instincts, but really spend as much time as you can on those campuses, talking to students in different settings, in different environments, and reading tons of reviews. And I would say, and you can even talk to alum if you have them in your network, especially younger ones.
Yes.
All of that, and you should do really well. But it's a really, really, really good question because it is an adjustment. It'd be no dissimilar from I've always worked in really small companies and we've had like 12 to 15 and everybody knew everything, and now I'm taking a position at a multinational corporation and I have 10,000. Like that's going to be an adjustment for a 35 or 45-year-old.
Right.
So, someone who hasn't had as many life experiences, or 16, 17, 18, it is going to be an adjustment. But, I oftentimes say when you put yourself in dissimilar environments from what you're used to, that's a lot of times where the growth occurs too.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Anything else on this one, Julia?
Just completely agree. And I do say, especially if you can't maybe visit that big school, we're in Boston. A lot of my students love Michigan and Wisconsin. Most of them actually won't be able to visit until after they're admitted. So we have them go to UMass Amherst, UMass Boston to see what a commuter school looks like, see what a large state school looks like. As you mentioned, Mark, we connect them with alums that can tell them, here was my biggest transition from a small environment to a large one. And then we work with the student to figure out, here are the skills you need. Do you think these are things you're willing to work on? And sometimes the student will be like, nope, you know what? I really don't like writing emails and I really don't like doing those things. And then I'll just put in a personal plug is that I grew up, Brandy, I did not get to go to an independent school. I went to a public school in my life, but I grew up in a somewhat rural, very small, insular community. And I went to a small school and I was like, this is huge. Like, so even though it was a small school,
Mhm.
I went from 170 kids in my grade, if you will, to 600 kids in my grade. And I remember at graduation, a very large chunk of students walking across the stage. And I was like, who is that? I have never seen. So just because it's a small school doesn't actually also mean it's going to be a small environment necessarily.
I learned something about you, Julie. I didn't know you only had 170 in your graduating class in high school.
Yeah, it was small. It was a regional high school. We had 3 towns because there was not enough people living around the area.
Wow.
So yeah, 30 minutes from my high school. It took me a while to get there.
I'm glad you brought the point up, though, about like visiting other schools that might be similar. Because sometimes when we talk about visiting, we make it sound like it's really simple to do. It's not simple to do.
No.
Like you're missing high school, which is hard. Parents are busy. Financial constraints can play a role,
Mhm.
especially if you're looking at schools like all the way across the country or outside of a day's drive.
Right.
Like most people run into challenges with visits, either money or time, one of the two.
Yeah. Or you play a fall sport and your
Correct.
Saturdays and evenings
Correct.
are all gobbled up. Yep.
Yeah, the extracurriculars in general, musicals, dance, all this stuff makes it hard. So the idea of visiting closer locations that are similar, and if you're working with a counselor, they can help you with that and make some suggestions. That can be a great way to do that, because I think sometimes we just throw visiting out like it's like the easiest thing to do in the world, and it's not, especially getting to like all your schools. So thank you, Brandy from Houston.
Yes. Good luck, Brandy.
Good luck, Brandy. And Brandy, for sending that question in to us. You're going to get a copy of Elliot Felix's book, How to Get the Most Out of College, 127 Ways to Make Connections, Make It Work for You, and Make a Difference. Please send your email in to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com and just indicate, I'm the one who asked that question on episode 359, and here's my mailing address.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, on the third part of Julia and my interview with Lee Coffin, the VP of Enrollment at Dartmouth College, Julia asks if a student should only submit their test scores if their scores are at the median test score level, or would he recommend that they submit their scores if they're anywhere in the middle 50% of the testing profile. Lee explains one of the biggest misperceptions about test optional applicants, and he shares what their initial observations are for those who are not submitting test scores. And Lee answers the question, are they seeing more non-competitive applicants now that students do not have to submit test scores? Listen and enjoy. Julia, got another test score question for us?
Yes, it's the usual follow-up about, well, what do you mean by recommended or report if you want to? So curious about any advice. And again, it depends. It could really be different for everyone. But thinking about when someone should submit or not submit their test scores. So similar to what Mark said earlier, that some admission officers say if you're not first generation college student or you're not under-resourced, that if you look at the middle point of a college, so this is for someone who's not in those two categories, but if you look at the middle point of a college's middle 50th percentile scores, and if your scores are at the median, then you can submit safely. While others say that if your scores are between the 25th and 75th percentile, go ahead and submit. What would you advise out of those, or anything at all, or is it just too complicated?
Yeah, it was your kid, knowing what you know.
Yeah.
Applying at Dartmouth.
Yeah.
Well, I had dinner last week with a friend and her high school rising senior daughter, and this question came up, and I said to her, she had taken the test 3 times. I said, so you've got scores. Your list, as you're describing it to me, seems thoughtfully centered around your transcript and that testing profile. And I said, I would include them. They are they weren't outstanding, but they were solid by any measure. And I said, put them in play. I think what's hard about answering this question, kind of in the macro way, is what I think has taken foot over the last 2 or 3 years, as we've all been optional by pandemic, is students seeing the optional as a free pass into an applicant pool that they might not have considered before. And what I've noticed as I'm reading files, and we could, we read by high school, and when I click sort by GPA, what I've noticed is the testing starts to disappear around the midpoint of that school group. And the lower you get in the GPA order, the more test optional that docket looks. They weren't going to get in with testing or without testing on most cases because they were not in the competitive band based on their transcript. And I think that's the piece that's getting lost in this optional space. Are there students who don't test well? Yes. When I was at Conn College, it was a test optional school then. And I saw lots of students who were top 5, 10% of their class, no testing, great curriculum, great grades. The teachers loved them. We didn't need testing to know this was a great student. But for students who fall outside of the norm, they all have scattergrams usually in their high schools now, and you can see where the little history points them. It's the lack of testing is not a resurrection strategy. You cannot take a candidacy that someone said this is unlikely and turn it into a possible, because suddenly you withhold testing. And we're doing our homework. A lot of us have extended the optional policy and have said we are studying it. That means we are studying it. And, we are seeing, people without testing being several hundred points below the norm in our pool. When the College Board shares with us afterwards, like, this is what your pool looked like. We are seeing some performance differences open up during the first year of our curriculum, especially in the math sequence. And, you start to connect the dots and say, there's a pattern here that testing in context can help us make a thoughtful decision. All places are not going to say that sentence I just said. But I see the place that's high volume, that's, the College Board now categorizes places like Dartmouth as extremely selective. Data is helpful to help move this pool from January 1st to the end of March.
So, and Julius, what I picked up from your answer, you wouldn't use the median as a cutoff.
No.
For submitting. Are you also comfortable with saying if you get into the middle 50% range, which is still a pretty high number for a place like Dartmouth?
Yeah, most of our applicants fall there.
Sure.
I think the people who are most kind of frustrated, they're above the 75th percentile, and the testing is the shiniest part of the file.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there are students below the 25th percentile, and it's like, okay, well, you're below our mid-range, but again, in your local context, those scores are really wonderful. And that's more true than not, where you're going into urban or rural communities where people aren't taking test prep. And so, they're getting an 1190, and that is a legit strong score from a student from that high school, and they are admitted to places like Dartmouth in combination with a transcript that shows they have pursued the most rigorous curriculum available in that high school and done well. And this is where we talk about holistic review. I'm giving you a kind of an example of it, where all these pieces connect, and one by itself does not. And testing, I think people are overthinking it about whether to send it in or not. Or I've taken it 3 times and I'm still in the lower part of well, you tested well, or you tested consistently, listen to your college counselor around whether that score in the pool you're considering is value added or going to raise an eyebrow.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Hi, this is Linda with this week's recommended resource, the website Macleans Education. The site is for students and families interested in Canadian colleges and universities. The website provides rankings of Canadian schools based on a number of categories like total number of faculty awards, student-to-faculty ratios, the best student services, total research dollars, and of course, by reputation. They also provide school profiles and student life information. The site is really well organized and easy to use. You can search by school name, province, or program. The site also has articles on the application process, student interviews, and details on graduate programs. For students looking at the possibility of continuing their education in Canada, their first stop should be Macleans Education at education.macleans.ca.
And I think the point you brought up, I loved how you articulated several things. One, you really articulated well how scores are read in context. I think that's really important. The other thing, something we all encounter, is one positive thing about the test was, to some extent, it provided a little bit of a yellow light, red light for people that were way out of profile. You do get people who are way out of profile who think without that test requirement, maybe I'll have a shot.
Right.
Now, counselors like Julie and I, we can counsel people like that, but not everybody's coming with, counseling. But one thing, I know you probably know Karen Christoph, I would think. Very well. Yeah. I would figure you would. So Karen's been an interview on here and actually comes on as a co-host once a year. She said something in my interview with her that we in admissions have to do a better job of explaining holistic admissions. And I think that's a lot of the problem, because, in reality that if you have an uncompetitive academic profile, you're not going to get rescued by a recommendation or an essay. But that's not often how the public hears it. They hear all these parts are equal, and maybe if I'm a little weaker here, I'll compensate over here. And so I do think admission officers need to do a better job of explaining, when you have an uncompetitive academic profile, you're highly unlikely to be admitted at a highly selective school. And so that's just a bit of a challenge I have, because I think Karen's right. I don't know if that's fair, but
it's fair. And it's hard. I think we do our best to explain holistic. I think there are two conundrums. Mm-hmm. It's complicated enough that things get lost in translation. Sure. And I've had enough interviews with news reporters over the years where they stop the conversation about, they say, this is too complicated. I don't have this many characters to tell this story. I'm like, and which is why I love podding, because you can say what you're going to say and get it out there. But I think there's also, back to grade inflation, I think one of the little conundrums we have is a lot of people get A's, and it's hard for a family sometimes to understand, what does this report card mean out of this particular high school, or when you load it into the big universe of people applying. I mean, just as a kind of put a pin in that, Dartmouth had applicants last year from 7,000 high schools around the world. Yeah. So, you're reading these files, looking at local curricula, sometimes national curricula, different grading patterns and scales in that curricula. And where does the testing amplify, support, contradict the transcript? And I think I would say it's holistic is misunderstood. I think the idea that we read in context is largely unknown to people. And when I explain it, people say, that makes so much sense. I'm like, yeah. And that's what we do. But perhaps we haven't put enough of a spotlight on the contextual piece that we really do go into a local community school and say, what's the norm here? And how do I evaluate you against that norm?
Well, Lee, we have a section on our episodes. You might have heard this, but we always have a recommended resource every Thursday. And so your podcast has been recommended twice.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally say your podcast and Inside the Yale Admission Office are the two that are on my must listen to list.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And so I appreciate the work you're doing. But one thing that was said recently on Inside the Yale Admission podcast is they have implemented a whole new step in their reading process because they're getting more non-competitive applicants in this test optional world. So in effect, they've almost created, I don't want to use the word auto denial, but they've created a process where something's non-competitive, it can get flagged by a senior person and shot up and not have to go through the full read. What percentage would you say of your applicants are academically competitive? I think I've heard you say about 78% before. Yeah. And has that number gone down in the test optional world? Like, do you see more non-competitive applicants off of transcript that are throwing their name in the hat because they're not getting that yield sign of a test score? Maybe I'm not a match.
Yeah. We've had a similar phenomenon that you just described at Yale, where we've, just for workflow efficiency, we've had to reroute some files from the bottom kind of cohort into a faster track to say, like, this one's just not going to make it. Back to you, Mark made a comment a minute ago about testing that, let's see what happens. And the answer is we know what happens. Like, you're throwing your hat into these pools and creating volume that is signaling heightened selectivity, but some of the growth is coming from places where the apps aren't realistic. And one of the things that is really tricky in this question you're asking is some of the growth is coming from international students without testing. And I think that's true across many of us, where we're seeing big growth from places where we have not historically seen applicants, and then there's no testing. And so, these two, that's another part of this topic. But I would not say the quality of the overall pool has gone down. I just did a presentation on Friday at Reunion, and I said, in any given year, about 3/4 of our pool is qualified. Like, they passed the first threshold of transcript review, testing if it's there. Key question, can you do the work here? And do the work is not, you're going to be Phi Beta Kappa 4 years later. Do the work is, am I going to have faculty members in my inbox saying, hey, I'm teaching fill in the blank class, and there's an unevenness to the people in the room with me that is alarming. That's a fail on my part if the faculty starts to say that. And so one of the things we're doing is, across this really heterogeneous landscape of high schools and heterogeneous people in those high schools, trying to say, if I bring you together in a seminar of 15 people at Dartmouth College next fall, is there common ability in the room so that whatever the topic, whatever the professor, the class begins and it moves forward? And that's hopefully the goal.
Thank you. Did you want to say something a second ago, Julia? Looked like we was.
I just wanted to back up, Lee, that pre-pandemic, so scores were still required by the majority of colleges that my students were applying for. I had a student who applied to Dartmouth in the regular round, and poor Lee has to read a quarter of her class pretty much every year. and the student was a really strong student on a transcript, and their scores were actually quite below Dartmouth's even median sort of area. and they were admitted and they graduated and they loved it. And I remember talking to Lee about it, and it was just like, no question. Like, I didn't even remember about the scores because the student was such a good fit for us and so strong that to be a mission driven school that we had to not, give a lot of weight to those scores. So I know that's one data point, but I just like to give a little oomph to what people are saying, because my partner, I think if you listen to the podcast, people have heard me talk about him, but no one in his family went to college. He didn't get the opportunity to go to college. And even when I talk to him, it's just this perception that these very elite selective places they can't possibly be, practicing holistic admissions. How do they have time for that? And I think it gets wrapped up in I just know about two pathways. It's your grades and your scores. So it's just hard for maybe the average person to realize that there's a lot of thought and time put behind these things, and that it is meant to serve the student. You're trying to root for the student at the end of the day. And I think a lot of people have just been sort of, understandably so, just feel that it's so selective that it can't possibly be contextual or thoughtful.
Friends, this concludes the third part of Julie and my interview with Lee Coffin. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, hopefully you heard the first part of the spotlight that Kevin Newton did on clearing, a concept I know a lot of us are not familiar with that is very popular in the UCAS system. We touch on that a little today, but we mostly talk about AP scores and SAT and ACT scores, and how much weight do they carry in international colleges? How important are they? Listen and enjoy. Do you know if they look at school profiles at all? So, one of the reasons why U.S. schools can get away with not relying as much on AP or IB or scores is we have something called the school profile, which is included in every application sent out by the counselor, that gives a lot of really validating information about the school so that an individual college can know the level of rigor and the caliber of the instruction. Caliber of instruction is too precise. Let's just say the demographics of the student body, some indications of the factors that colleges traditionally have used to gauge whether or not this is a college preparatory environment. There can be all kinds of different things in there. They vary so much, but it becomes actually an extremely important tool for a college to put a student in the context of a school and understand their preparation and their background. That's what has allowed colleges to oftentimes bypass scores. And the other thing is their own institutional history with that school, which obviously the UK, one-offs from the US, you're not going to have a lot of institutional history. But we get that over here too, because not every school is sending double-digit kids to every college. But is there any understanding of a school profile and looking at it? Does it factor into admissions at all, or is it a non-factor?
It's starting to become more of a factor, and some universities are starting to, I don't want to say flat out require it yet, but it is one of those optional documents you can include, especially if you're applying without the test scores. And again, I want to emphasize that by far the more surefire method that gives you the most options is to have those AP or IB results, or at least to be taking those courses and plan on taking the assessments. But for universities that don't, in fact, I believe that I can't remember the exact university, but there was somewhere in the Netherlands, I believe, has started even including that as a recommended document if you're applying from overseas, and they want to have access to it just in case they can kind of place you in some form of perspective of just how sharp you are compared to your classmates.
So, Kevin, are there some things going on with clearance that are different than what you've seen in the past? Or is it just, look, this has been this way for 20 years, but Americans just need to know about it? Or are you seeing any changes when it comes to clearance now versus, 5 or 10 years ago?
That's a great question. So this past clearing year, 2022, has seen a number of changes. Probably the biggest is, for an inexplicable reason in the past, the British universities had clearing and adjustment. Clearing was for students who didn't quite meet their mark for their offers. Adjustment was for students who exceeded their mark and were trying to get into a higher ranked university. And I think they figured out this year that that's a little redundant and that they can do it all at once. And there have been some hiccups on the way, to put it very mildly. Um, One of the disadvantages of doing a call to apply someplace is they're on British office hours, which for those on the East Coast isn't so horrible. You just get up before noon and keep trying. And also the phone lines were often quite busy. But for someone living in Los Angeles or Seattle or San Francisco, it can be a little, how should I put this? If you're not a morning person, it's not always a fun thing to do. I was working with someone who absolutely is not a morning person, and she's going through clearing, and she said, well, I'll just stay up till 2 a.m. and give them a call. And she's based on the West Coast. And it might just be my advanced age, but if I'm not in bed by 11, then something has gone drastically wrong, unless there's a promise of fast food tacos at the end of the night. So it is, so I think they're still working that out. And especially with regards to being able to apply online, some universities have it, some don't. I think it's a great idea to be able to register your interest and then have the university give you a call back if the interests line up. Or for a lot of students, if you don't have those standard qualifications like AP scores or an IB diploma, to be able to attach your transcript and have the university call you back and discuss your interests. Something I don't know if we've talked about before, Mark, but might be worth doing an episode on in the future, are foundation years, which are kind of a backdoor in. And there's a number of pros and cons to them that they can open a lot of doors, but at the same time, it also abrogates a lot of those advantages to going overseas in the first place, namely, or specifically on the cost and the savings of time. So, but I think that's for a different episode.
You've tantalized me there. Let's do it. Yeah, no, but we need to do that. That sounds that'll be very interesting to a lot of our listeners. So Kevin, a lot of students I work with now are taking APs outside of their school. They're doing an online AP, and it could be a lot of different reasons. It could be a schedule conflict. It could be an area of interest that their school doesn't offer. Could be both, a combination of both. And they could also like the idea of sort of bolstering their credentials and showing the colleges their rigor and their initiative and that sort of thing in an area of interest. How does the UCAS system or the schools in the system, how do they look at a student getting an AP score at something that was not tethered to an AP course taught at their high school?
Very favorably, especially if it's something related to what they're wanting to study. Because not only does it show that you've got the base knowledge to continue into further study of that particular subject, but just as importantly, if not more importantly, it shows that you were motivated to go off and pursue something outside of class. So we talk a lot about extracurriculars and how vitally important they are in the U.S. And one of those quips that for those of us who look at overseas admissions more is that extracurriculars don't matter unless they're directly related to what you want to study, in which case they can be very powerful. And that's a perfect example of that. Being able to dig into something that you don't know or you're not getting exposure to in class, but prove that you've got the ability to learn it on your own, that stands out to a British university.
Yeah, and a couple things. There are sizable numbers of schools in our country that extracurriculars don't matter, and so that's always what's tricky thing talking about U.S. schools. There are a lot of schools that are strictly making decisions off transcripts, and then there's tends to be your more selective ones doing holistic admissions that are looking at the recs and the essays and the personal qualities and the demonstrated interest and fit to major and all these other things like extracurriculars. So that's a school by school thing. But I was thinking about our conversation we had a few minutes ago about students that are at schools that don't offer APs because they're doing some advanced thing. Those students are highly advised to go ahead and take the APs anyway. I know when I was at Westtown, we would have kids that would routinely go ace those APs, even if they weren't taking an AP course. Some
Right.
cases it involved a little bit extra study, but even in a U.S. system, doing well on an AP test that's not necessarily tethered to an AP course is a great positive sign of content mastery, um, initiative. And I think initiative is really appealing because colleges know that there's a structural apparatus that a high school offers that is conducive to doing well, namely attendance and quizzes and tests and report cards and all that. If you go do something completely on your own without all that structural apparatus, it does speak to your discipline, motivation, drive, and it is a good way to showcase a level of independence that's oftentimes conducive with doing well in a university environment that's going to give you way more freedom than your high school environment. Thoughts on that?
Absolutely agree. And I think that, again, all those advantages that apply to students who independently study for an AP exam also apply for those who have maybe taken what their high school calls advanced chemistry, which is actually verging on organic chemistry, but they just call it advanced chemistry on the transcript and then take an AP exam and get a 4 or a 5 on it. It's not necessarily at the end of the day that you have to have that course designation. It's the test that ultimately matters. Now that said, if you are applying without having taken the test and are applying on the merits of your transcript, that overseas universities, especially in the UK and Ireland, know what honors and advanced placement classes are. No advanced, but that's when having someone explain what certain courses are may be of particular assistance there.
Do you find it's similar to what I said, that your more selective schools want 4s and 5s, your most selective schools want 5s, but there's a group of schools that 3s are perfectly fine for? Is that similar
Absolutely.
to over here? So that dynamic
Absolutely.
would be the same. And is it also similar that for the most part 1s and 2s aren't really kind of respected anywhere, or are 2s seen as okay some places as well?
I honestly cannot think of a place that's happy with a 2. There are
Yeah, so
dozens of
similar
universities
here.
that are
Yeah.
happy with 3s, but
Yeah.
I'm not going to discount that there may be a number of them out there, but I think at that point they would almost just rather do a transcript review and see that you have a solid GPA and that you've taken some at least honors level classes. But that would kind of be the cutoff, and then that raises a whole slew of questions of motivation to going overseas and things like that. So
Sure. But I'm hearing from you that APs carry more weight than SATs and ACTs.
yes.
Hmm.
So at some universities, there's a requirement for both. But something worth noting is that the ACT or SAT is going to almost always just be a minimum. So, for example, at Cambridge, you've got to have a 1500 to apply to STEM subjects. And I think it's a 1450 or 1460 to apply to non STEM subjects. It's not going to help you to get a 1600. They would rather you than invest the hours in studying for those extra 100 points. They would rather you go off and pursue something, an independent study project in science or whatever your field of interest is. It's just a minimum to make sure that, frankly, you're not so laser focused that you're not able to function in another field. And again, Oxford and Cambridge are kind of rare in that. The next step down in universities like Edinburgh, I think, is a 1320 or so. St. Andrews is somewhere in there for the SAT, and around a 28 or so on the ACT, whatever the concordance tables has it as. But once you get beyond those universities that a lot of Americans apply to, they don't have an ACT or SAT requirement. So it's definite if you've got strong feelings against the ACT or SAT, cast a wide net. And I think you'll find a lot of places are very happy to just pretend that it doesn't exist.
Kevin, in some ways, there's more similarities between what you're describing and what I experience over here. The difference is over here, unless it's schools that admit by numbers, they're just not explicit about that. So one of my favorite questions I still do it, but I used to do it routinely. I used to love to ask schools regarding test scores is the following. What numbers make you nervous? And what numbers, for all intensive purposes, are basically cutoffs unless it's an extremely rare situation? I get it. The best quarterback in the country, you've got a football team. That doesn't apply. I get it. The president's kid wants to go. That doesn't apply. I get it. There are exceptions to everything. But that's not something that schools would share in an information session in front of students. But that's a conversation I can have with schools. And it's like, what are the numbers? If you see them, it's like, ooh, these numbers aren't good. And what are the numbers that are like, almost like, what, we can't go there. Colleges have those numbers. They're not going to be tethered to we can't go there because there's some exceptions. But those exceptions are for hooked applicants. And the difference that I'm hearing you say is in the UCAS system, they're just explicit. They're just going to tell you 1,500 for STEM, 1,460 here, 1,320 at Edinburgh, and that's what you don't see over here. You sometimes see it now in this test optional world where some schools are coming out and telling people, if this is your score, submit. And if not, I recommend you don't, which is basically telling you the same thing. That's the question that I was always getting at. And quite honestly, admission officers didn't like when I asked that question because they're really into hemming and hawing, but they would answer it for me most of the time. If I had a good relationship with somebody, they would answer it. They might have a few caveats,
right?
But they would answer it. And I said, I just need to know. I'm not trying to get into all your secret sauce. I just need to know so that I know the right kids to recommend to your school. And so I actually like the system there in that sense, in that it's at least clear for applicants. I guess the downside of it is the rigidity. If a school says a 1320, then you lose that kid that was a 1300 that was just a complete diamond in the rough, and they would have been a total rock star because you're so tethered to an objective criteria. And our sort of holistic admissions allows you to have, if you're showing exceptional personal qualities and intangibles and what some schools refer to as non-cognitive variables, then you can compensate for that. Things like grit and motivation and resiliency and drive and optimism and a bunch of other traits that schools have found correlates highly to academic success. And over here, there's such an understanding that the GPA and the transcript is a better predictor of grades than a score.
Yeah, it's, again, some universities do have some wiggle room there. Oxford and Cambridge, not so much, but I don't want to be too specific so that I don't, call out the student in question, but we've definitely had students who applied to top 10 universities in the UK, top 20 universities globally, and everything else was okay except a single standardized test score. And that's why I say the first step should be calling the university. And they were very happy to take this student regardless. And this student's doing quite well there. But again, it's at Oxford and Cambridge, probably not so much, because they admittedly, how should I put this? They're very driven to just make sure that academics comes first always, and with a huge gulf between it and anything else. And for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, they've decided that this is the indicator they want to use. But again, for a lot of other universities over there, it's not quite what it is here in the U.S., where there's not going to be unless you're royalty. I will say that if you're a member of the royal family, you can get away with Prince Charles probably should not have been at Cambridge.
Sure.
Prince William should not have been at St. Andrews with his grades. He ended up doing quite well. Well, Prince William did. And Prince Charles.
There's always exception.
But
so listen, Kevin, this has been great. If in closing, if you could just summarize sort of the steps that somebody should take. If let's say they apply UCAS system, they don't match in any of the 5, what should they then do? If you could just summarize and walk through that, just so that part's clear.
Sure. So the first thing after your initial 5 don't match, or if you've are just getting into UCAS, if you've decided this is an option for you, is start adding programs through UCAS Extra. You can do one at a time, and they each have 3 weeks to respond. If that doesn't work and it's after the beginning of July and you've received your AP scores or your IB results for all your final grades, then you can start using the online applications in specific schools. But the main thing to remember is always make sure you've applied through UCAS first, simply because that's the clearinghouse from which all the universities are going to draw your information. And it also streamlines everything from the visa to accommodations to everything else. So step 1, make sure you've applied through UCAS or you've submitted a UCAS application. Step 2, contact the universities and specifically the programs you're interested in.
And I'll say something that you won't say that I'll say. If all this feels overwhelming, you could reach out to Kevin, and he does a complimentary half-an-hour consultation. And if it feels like for my peace of mind, I'd just rather have a professional guide me through all this. If you go to yourcollegeboundkid.com and go down to meet the team, his contact information is all on there. And a lot of times, people can be listening and they can be like, I just want a professional. This is just overwhelming. And I know you're not going to come on here and say that, but I will say that about you. Because I know several people that have done that and they have been very pleased. So I have no problem in putting a plug in for your services, my friend.
I appreciate it, Mark.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you soon. If you come back and talk foundations or another hot school or hot topic in the world, we've gotten a really good response from your quarterly visits, Kevin. And so I want to keep that going and make sure that we don't slip, because it's like you can. Next thing you know, you wake up and 6 months have gone by and be like, we missed Kevin. So I'll be in touch and we'll look forward to having you back in the next few months, my friend.
Absolutely. I look forward to it, Mark.
All right. Take care. Friends, on Monday's episode, I'll continue to share insights from the session I had this week with Emory, Rice, WashU, Cornell, and Pomona. And we'll continue with Lisa's interview with Brian Burgess, the executive director of the fraternity Delta Theta Chi, as they'll continue talking about questions and answers about fraternity life. And friends, I close you out with a quote from Aaron Pansami, who was in the admission office at a number of places, Caltech, UChicago, and others. This is a time when a number of students are trying to figure out what activities should I get involved in. And here's what Aaron said. Nobody cares what your activities are at all. All they care is that you care what your activities are. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.